On a Friday night in January, in a country where strangers trust strangers and front doors are often left unlocked, a 20-year-old woman with bright orange hair laughed her way out of a nightclub and stepped into the freezing dark. Her name was Berna and she had no reason to be afraid. Nobody in Iceland did. She was 3 streets from a warm bed, a hangover, and an ordinary Saturday she would never live to see. Within hours, her face would be on every screen in the nation. Within days, an entire country would be searching for her. And before the month was out, the safest place on Earth would learn that it had never been safe at all. To understand what Iceland lost, you first have to understand who Berna Bjarnadóttir was, because she was never just a name in a headline. She was born on the 28th of November 1996 into a small, close world at the edge of the Arctic. Reykjavik is not a city in the way most capitals are. It is a town that happens to be a capital, home to barely 120,000 people, set against black volcanic rock, steaming geothermal vents, and winters so long that the sun barely climbs above the rooftops. For months of the year, children walk to school in darkness and come home in darkness. To outsiders, it sounds bleak. To Icelanders, it is simply home, a place where everyone seems connected by no more than 2 or 3 degrees of separation, where the nation feels less like a country and more like an enormous extended family. Berna lived in Breiðholt, a residential district on the eastern edge of the capital, with her father. Her parents were no longer together, but the divorce had not fractured the family the way divorce sometimes does. Her mother and father remained on warm, easy terms, and Berna sat squarely at the center of both their lives. She was by every account adored, not in the abstract way that grief tends to polish the dead, but genuinely daily by the people who knew her best. Those who loved her described a young woman who was impossible not to like. She had a sharp, quick sense of humor, the kind that could turn a dull afternoon at work into something worth remembering. Friends called her their happy pill, the person you wanted in the room when the mood needed lifting. She was witty and warm and a little bit fearless, the friend who stayed out later, danced longer, and squeezed more out of an ordinary evening than anyone else. Reporters who later spoke to those closest to her settled on the same handful of words again and again: kind, fun-loving, full of life. She had her father's practical streak too. For all her free spirit, Berna was responsible. She held down a steady job in the sales section of Hagkaup, a busy department store in Reykjavik, where she worked alongside friends and earned a reputation for reliability. She was the kind of employee who simply showed up on time every time. That detail will matter later more than anyone could have known. Music was her great passion, and she refused to be boxed in by it. She listened to everything: rap one moment, folk the next, pop, rock, whatever moved her. There was an openness to her taste that mirrored the openness in her personality, a curiosity about the wider world that pulled at her from her small island home. She loved other cultures. She dreamed of seeing more of the planet than the slice of it she had been born onto. The summer before, she had met a young American, Andrew Morgan, an industrial design student from Salt Lake City, Utah, while he was traveling, and the two had dated. It was the romance of someone reaching outward toward bigger horizons, toward a life that was only just beginning to take shape. Because that is the cruelest part of Berna's story. At 20, she was not at the end of anything. She was at the very start. She had a job, a circle of devoted friends, parents who loved her, a world she wanted to explore. She was, in the most ordinary and beautiful sense, an unfinished person, full of plans she hadn't made yet, places she hadn't seen, versions of herself she hadn't grown into. And she lived in a country that, more than almost anywhere on Earth, seemed designed to let young people like her flourish in safety. Iceland has one of the lowest murder rates in the world. There have been entire years, 2003, 2006, 2008, when not a single person was killed. The police do not routinely carry firearms. There is no standing army. The harsh climate and the long isolation have bred a culture of profound mutual reliance. People look out for one another, take care of their neighbors, leave their cars running outside shops, accept lifts from people they've only just met. Crime, when it comes at all, tends to be small. Violence is the stuff of imported television dramas, not real life. A young woman walking home alone through Reykjavik at 5 in the morning was not doing anything reckless. She was doing what thousands of Icelanders had done safely for generations. On Friday the 13th of January, 2017, Berna finished her shift and did exactly what a happy, sociable 20-year-old does at the end of a working week. She went out. She met her friends, and together they headed into the heart of the capital for a night of drinks, laughter, and dancing. They ended up at Hura, a popular club in the city center where up-and-coming bands played, and the night unspooled the way the best nights do: loose, loud, joyful. Before long, Berna was up dancing, lost in the music she loved so much. By 2 in the morning, her friends were tiring, ready to call it a night. Berna was not. She wanted to keep going, to stretch the evening just a little further. So she stayed, waving them off, promising she'd be fine the way she always was. It was such an ordinary decision. The kind every one of us has made 100 times. Stay a bit longer, have one more, walk home after. She finally stepped out into the night just before 5 in the morning into temperatures hovering around -9 degrees, and went looking for something to eat before the long walk home. Somewhere in the dark city her path was about to cross with someone else's, a stranger she had never met, a man who had no reason to know her name and every reason to make sure no one ever heard it spoken by her again. Berna had no idea, she just kept walking. Every murder has two stories running toward the same point in the dark. Berna's was a story of light, of friendship, music, a young life reaching outward. The other story belonged to a man who at that very hour was sitting behind the wheel of a rented red car on the streets of a city that was not his own. His name was Thomas Frederick Mahler Olsen. He was 25 years old. And almost everything about him would prove harder to see clearly than it should have been. Olsen was not Icelandic. He came from Greenland, the vast, sparsely populated Arctic island to the northwest, a Danish territory of fewer than 60,000 people scattered across frozen coastline and isolated fishing settlements. Greenland and Iceland are Nordic neighbors bound by geography, climate, and a shared dependence on the brutal northern sea. For young men in Greenland, the fishing industry is often the entire economy, long, punishing voyages aboard trawlers that vanish over the horizon for weeks at a time, hauling cod and halibut from some of the most dangerous waters on the planet. It was this life that had brought Olsen to Iceland in the winter of 2017, as a crew member aboard a Greenlandic trawler called the Polar Nano Q. Here, honesty matters more than drama. Much of what we would normally want to know about a killer, the childhood, the family, the early warning signs, was never made public in Olsen's case. Greenland is small, private, and protective of its own, and no detailed psychiatric evaluation or childhood history was ever released to the press or entered into the public record in the way it might be in a larger country. There is no documented diagnosis to point to, no neatly packaged trauma to explain him. Anyone who tells you otherwise is filling silence with invention. What we can say is built only on the record that does exist, and that record, when you trace it backward, is more troubling than reassuring. Because Thomas Mahler Olsen had crossed paths with the law before, and not only over the cargo he carried. In 2011, 6 years before he ever set foot in Reykjavik, a young Greenlandic woman accused him of rape. According to the Icelandic newspaper Fréttablaðið, which later reported on the case, the woman said the assault had taken place at a party. She described lying on a bed, talking on the phone with her boyfriend and falling asleep after they hung up, only to wake and find Olsen assaulting her, too intoxicated to fight him off or make him stop. It is a devastating allegation. It is also one that, crucially, did not end in conviction. Olsen was tried in a court in Greenland and acquitted of the charge. In the eyes of the law, he walked away an innocent man. But the pattern that allegation describes, a woman incapacitated, vulnerable, unable to defend herself, would echo with awful precision in what was to come. There was a second, firmer line on his record. Olsen had a criminal history connected to drugs. Police would later state that he had a record for dealing hashish in Greenland, and that history was not incidental to his presence in Iceland. It was, in a sense, the whole reason he was there. The Polar Nano Q was not simply a fishing vessel making an ordinary stop. Hidden aboard it, and later in Olsen's own cabin, was a substantial quantity of pressed hashish. Reports placed the haul at more than 20 kilograms, with a street value in Iceland estimated at well over $1 million. The trawler had docked in Hafnarfjörður, a quiet harbor town about 10 miles south of Reykjavik, from the middle of that week, and the men aboard had days to kill in port while the larger criminal enterprise played out. This is the gap that the killer's story is built into. By every outward appearance, Olsen was unremarkable. To the men he worked beside on the Polar Nano Q, he did not register as dangerous. He was a crewman like any other, doing the same brutal work, sleeping in the same cramped quarters, drinking in the same harbor bars. When the case later exploded across the news and suspicion fell on the ship, his own captain reportedly reassured him that if he was innocent, he had nothing to fear. That is the quiet horror at the center of so many cases like this one. The most ordinary-seeming man in the room is sometimes the one to be afraid of. There was no visible monster. There was just a fisherman with a rented car and a secret cargo, blending seamlessly into a port town that suspected nothing. On Friday the 13th of January, the same day Berna was finishing her shift and getting ready to go out, Olsen made a small, practical decision that would tie the two of them together forever. He went to a local car rental and hired a vehicle, a red Kia Rio. There were more than 100 cars of that exact make and model in Iceland, an utterly forgettable choice, the kind of car that disappears into traffic. He would need it. In the early hours of Saturday morning, he used it to collect a fellow Polar Nano Q crewman, Nikolaj Olsen, no relation, despite the shared surname, from a bar in downtown Reykjavik. Nikolaj was, by his own later admission, severely intoxicated, barely able to recall the night at all. And so, as Friday tipped into Saturday, two trajectories were closing on each other across the sleeping capital. On one side of the city, a young woman with orange hair was dancing at Hura, laughing, deciding to stay just a little longer. On the other, a red rental car was moving slowly through the dark, carrying a man with a hidden criminal trade, a prior accusation that the courts had set aside, and a few empty hours in a foreign city where no one was watching. Reykjavik has very little surveillance. Its people had long ago decided they did not want their streets blanketed in cameras the way other capitals were. They trusted each other too much for that, and crime was too rare to justify it. On most nights, that trust cost nothing. It was simply how Iceland worked, a society that policed itself through decency rather than suspicion. But on this one night, that same trust meant there would be no all-seeing eye, no dense web of cameras to catch what happened in the gaps between the few that existed. Birna would leave the club just before 5. She would buy something to eat. She would walk into the cold toward home. And somewhere along Lagavgr, the main shopping street where she had walked 100 times before, a red Kia Rio was about to slow to a stop in front of her, and a stranger inside was about to offer a tired, intoxicated young woman a ride out of the freezing dark. She would get in just before 5 o'clock on the morning of Saturday, the 14th of January, 2017. Birna Bjarnstadtir stepped out of Hura and into the deep cold of a Reykjavik winter night. The temperature hovered somewhere around -9. Her friends had gone home hours earlier. She had stayed to dance, to stretch the night a little longer, the way she always did. Now, alone and tired and warm with the easy intoxication of a good night out, she did the most human thing imaginable. She went looking for food. Surveillance cameras, the few that Reykjavik had, caught her in fragments as she made her way along Lagavgr, the city's main shopping street. She bought a falafel pita and walked, eating in the rough direction of home. At one point she dropped some coins and stumbled, briefly bumping into a stranger on the side of the road before carrying on. There was nothing alarming in any of it. She was simply a young woman walking home in a country where walking home alone had never once felt like a risk. Then at around 5:25 in the morning, a car slowed beside her. It was the red Kia Rio. It stopped near number 31 Lagavgr. Inside were two men she had never met, Thomas Mahler Olsen behind the wheel and his severely intoxicated crewmate Nikolaj Olsen. What words passed between them no camera recorded, but the outcome is captured forever in grainy footage. Birna, trusting in the way Icelanders had trusted strangers for generations, climbed into the back of the car. The door closed, and the red Kia pulled away into the dark. That was the last time Birna Bjarnstadtir was seen alive by anyone but the men in that car. What happened over the next hour has been pieced together by police from surveillance footage, phone records, forensic evidence, and the routes the car was traced taking. The Kia drove south out of the capital toward the harbor town of Hafnarfjörður, about 10 miles away, the town where the Greenlandic trawler Polar Nano Q sat docked. At around 6:10 a.m., cameras at the harbor showed Nikolaj Olsen getting out of the car. Birna's mobile phone went dead at roughly the same time in that same area, its final signal pinging off a tower near the harbor. She never turned her phone off. Everyone who knew her knew that. After dropping Nikolaj near the ship, Olsen did not leave. Police later established that he drove the car to a secluded spot on the docks and remained there for around 50 minutes. It is in that window in the dark of the parked car beside the freezing sea that prosecutors say Birna was killed. The details are difficult, and they deserve to be stated plainly and without spectacle, because Birna was a person and not a plot point. According to the charges later brought against him, Olsen attacked her, beating her about the face and head with such force that her nose was broken, and strangling her. Then, while she was unconscious and stripped of her clothing, she was put into the water of the North Atlantic. The autopsy would later establish the single most harrowing fact of the entire case. Birna had survived the attack itself. The official cause of death was drowning. She was still alive when she entered the sea. Whether she was conscious, whether she knew, no one can say, and perhaps it is a mercy that we cannot. At around 7 that morning, Olsen left the harbor area in the car. He returned, oddly, at around 11:30. Birna, by then, was already gone. First alarm did not come from a witness or a camera, it came from her absence. Birna was reliable, relentlessly, dependably so. When she failed to show up for her shift at Hagkop, her friend and co-worker Maria Bjarnadottir was unsettled almost immediately. It was, she said, deeply unlike Birna to come in late, and stranger still that her phone was dead. People first assumed the ordinary, that she'd gone to her father's to sleep off the night, but she wasn't there. Her father didn't have her. Her mother didn't have her, none of her friends had her. The pieces refused to add up into anything reassuring. Her family did not wait. They went straight to the police and reported her missing. And then her mother turned to the one tool that, in a country as small and connected as Iceland, can move faster than any official channel. She posted to Facebook, asking friends to share, pleading for help finding her daughter. In a nation where everyone is 2 or 3 handshakes apart, the appeal spread like fire across dry grass. Within hours, Berna's face was everywhere. Within a day, it was headline news across the entire country. What followed was extraordinary. As the hours stretched past 24 past 36 with no sign of her, Iceland did what Iceland does. It came together. The case did not feel like a distant news story to the people of Reykjavik. It felt personal, as though one of their own daughters had vanished. Volunteers poured out to search. In the days that followed, it would become the largest search operation in Icelandic history. Some 800 people combing coastlines, harbors, and open ground, joined by helicopters, ships, and search dogs. The phrase that would soon define the case had not yet been spoken, but the feeling behind it was already there. She was everyone's sister, everyone's daughter. The investigation fell to some of the country's most experienced detectives, led by a veteran officer named Grimmer Grimson. And here the case revealed how unusual a place Iceland truly is. There was almost no CCTV to work with. Icelanders had long resisted blanketing their streets in cameras, trusting in community over surveillance. But the few cameras that existed had caught something. They had caught Berna entering a red Kia Rio. The trouble was the footage was grainy, the plate unreadable, and there were more than 100 identical cars in the country. To her desperate mother, the limits of the technology were agony. To the detectives, that single red car was the thread that might unravel everything if only they could pull it. So they pulled it. Officers traced the car's movements through the scattered cameras of the city and out toward the harbor. They followed it to Hafnarfjörður. And there, the trail led them somewhere no one had expected, to the docks and to a Greenlandic fishing trawler called the Polar Nano-Q. But by the time the detectives understood what they were looking at, a new and terrible problem had emerged. The Polar Nano-Q was no longer in port. The trawler had slipped its moorings and was steaming away from Iceland, back out into the open Atlantic, carrying its crew, its secrets, and the two men who had last been seen with Berna, beyond the reach of Icelandic police. The clock was running out. And somewhere on that ship was the only man who knew exactly what had happened to her. The Polar Nano-Q was already at sea, pushing northwest through the winter Atlantic toward Greenland when Icelandic authorities made their decision. They would not let the ship and the men aboard it slip beyond their reach. What followed was the kind of operation Iceland almost never mounts, in a country whose police do not normally carry guns. The only armed unit in the nation is a small, elite tactical force formerly called the Special Unit, but known to everyone by its nickname, the Viking Squad. They were mobilized. With the cooperation of Danish authorities, officers were flown out over open ocean toward a Danish Navy vessel, the HDMS Triton, which had set an intercept course to close on the trawler. As the Polar Nano-Q steamed for home, a helicopter descended over its deck, and Icelandic special forces were lowered onto the moving ship. There, far from land, they took two men into custody, Thomas Mahler Olsen and Nikolaj Olsen, and brought them back across the water to Icelandic soil in handcuffs. The detail that lingers is how surreal it was for a country like Iceland. A counterterror unit fast-roping onto a fishing boat in the North Atlantic to arrest a man for the murder of a girl who had simply wanted to walk home. Then on the 22nd of January, 8 days after she vanished, came the discovery the nation had been dreading. A Coast Guard helicopter scanning the coastline of the Reykjanes Peninsula southwest of the capital spotted something in the water near a lighthouse. It was a body. It was Berna. With those words, the search ended and the grief began. Iceland, a country that had gone entire years without a single murder, plunged into a collective mourning unlike anything in living memory. Now the detectives had their suspect in custody and finally a crime scene. The evidence began to stack up with damning consistency. The red Kia Rio was central. After the night of Berna's disappearance, the car had been returned and re-rented to an ordinary family, who soon complained of a strong chemical smell coming from the back of the vehicle. When police impounded and examined it, they found blood spotting in the rear seat. Samples were sent to Sweden for forensic analysis. The result confirmed everyone's worst fear: the blood was Berna's. But the car gave up far more than a few spots. Surveillance footage caught Olsen in the aftermath buying plastic bags and cleaning fluid, then scrubbing down the interior of the vehicle. He would later claim he had simply been sick and was cleaning up after himself. The detectives did not believe him, and the science backed their disbelief. When they sprayed the back of the car with luminol, a chemical that reveals blood invisible to the naked eye, the rear of the vehicle lit up. It was not a few spots that had been cleaned away. The back of the car had been awash in blood. The odometer told its own quiet story too. The car had been driven far further than a short trip across town would explain. The physical links to Berna kept multiplying. Her black Doc Martens boots, which she had been wearing that night, were found discarded near the Hafnarfjörður harbor. Her identification was recovered in connection with the ship and the suspect. Forensic testing placed Olsen's DNA on the lace of one of Berna's boots, and his fingerprints were found on her discarded driving license. A doctor who examined Olsen noted wounds on his chest consistent with a struggle. And separately, in his cabin aboard the Polar Nano Q, police uncovered the other half of his secret, more than 20 kilograms of pressed hashish, with a street value running into the millions, confirming that the trawler's voyage had been a smuggling run all along. Attention turned briefly to the second man. Nikolaj Olsen, no relation, had been arrested alongside Thomas, and at first his possible involvement could not be ruled out, but the evidence told a different story. Nikolaj had been seen leaving the car in the harbor before the killing, and he had been by every account far too intoxicated to have orchestrated anything. He even told police that Thomas had later tried to influence his recollection of the night to muddy what he remembered. The detectives came to believe he had played no part in Berna's death. After roughly 2 weeks in custody and extensive questioning, Nikolaj was released. That left Thomas Mahler Olsen alone at the center of the case, and he was not giving an inch. Across 9 separate interviews, he maintained his innocence. His account during interrogation was that he and Nikolaj had picked up 2 girls that night and later dropped them off unharmed. It was an account contradicted by the blood, the boots, the DNA, the fingerprints, and the timeline. Police could establish how, when, and where Berna had died. The one thing they could never establish was why. There was no clear motive, no prior connection between Olsen and Berna, no explanation that made human sense of it. He was a stranger who had offered a tired young woman a ride and then taken her life. On the 30th of March, 2017, Thomas Mahler Olsen was charged with murder in the first degree and with drug trafficking. His trial opened in August at the District Court of Reykjavik, and the nation followed every word. It was during that trial that Olsen abruptly changed his story. Now he said there had been only one girl, Berna, and he claimed that he had left the car and that Nikolaj had driven off with her, returning without her. Having spent months blaming no one, he now tried to pin the killing on the crewmate who had already been cleared. He admitted to the drug offense but denied the murder, his face covered, his voice low. The courtroom was stunned. To the detectives and the public alike, the shifting account looked less like the truth finally emerging and more like a desperate man searching for any door out. In September 2017, a panel of 3 judges delivered their verdict. Olsen was found guilty on all counts, guilty of the murder of Berna Bjarnstadtir and guilty of large-scale drug smuggling. He was sentenced to 19 years in prison, near the very top of what Icelandic law typically imposes, and ordered to pay millions in compensation and legal costs to Berna's grieving parents. He was not even present in court to hear the sentence read. Justice in the legal sense had been done with remarkable speed for a case of such magnitude. In the human sense, of course, nothing could be made whole. A nation had recovered its lost daughter only to bury her and convicted the man responsible only to find that he could offer no reason at all. Olsen would appeal, but that fight was still to come. And as the courtroom emptied and the cameras dispersed, Iceland was left holding a question its justice system could never answer. How does a country built on trust go on once it has learned what that trust can cost? When a country has gone whole years without a single murder, it does not have a script for grief on this scale. Iceland had to write one in real time, and what it wrote. In the days after Berna Bjarnstadtir's body came home from the sea was something close to a national act of mourning. Her funeral was held at Hallgrímskirkja, the towering, glacier-inspired church that dominates the Reykjavik skyline, the largest in the country. More than 2,000 people filled it, among them the President of Iceland and the Prime Minister. It is difficult to overstate what that means in a nation of fewer than 340,000 people. The country's most powerful figures sat in the same pews as Berna's school friends and co-workers, because in a place that small, the loss truly did belong to everyone. The chaplain who presided over the service spoke of how the case had changed the nation, had touched something in its very feeling of security, words that proved more prophetic than ceremonial. Out in the streets, the grief took a different shape. Thousands gathered on Lagavgur, the same shopping street where Berna had taken her last walk, and turned it into a river of candlelight. By some counts, 8,000 to 10,000 people joined a memorial in her honor, a staggering proportion of the population. And across social media, a single phrase spread until it became the emotional signature of the entire case: Agur Berna, I am Berna. It was an act of identification and defiance at once. Every woman who had ever walked home alone, trusting in the safety of her own country, was saying, this was not a stranger, this was one of us, this could have been any of us. That sentiment did not fade with the funeral candles. It reshaped how Icelanders thought about their own society. The case forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the very trust that had defined the nation: the unlocked doors, the lifts from strangers, the absence of cameras on the streets. In the aftermath, surveillance was increased around Reykjavik, a quiet concession from a people who had long preferred to police themselves through decency rather than technology. Women became more wary, more conscious of the walk home in a way they simply had not been before. A crime writer in Iceland captured the strangeness of it perfectly, noting that murders like this had previously belonged only to fiction. Now it had happened in the real world to a real girl with orange hair and a job at the department store, and the illusion of invulnerability was gone for good. For the man at the center of it, the years since have been a slow procession through the machinery of justice. Thomas Mahler Olsen appealed his 19-year sentence, taking his case to Iceland's newly established Court of Appeals, where his lawyers tried to redirect blame back onto his cleared crewmate and question the prosecution's account of how Birna ended up in the sea. The state prosecutor called the alternative theory absurd, pointing out that the crewmate, severely drunk and without even a driver's license, could not plausibly have committed the crime in the narrow window available. In November 2018, the appeals court upheld the conviction in full. The following year, at his own request, Olsen was transferred from Iceland to Denmark to serve out his sentence, and was placed in a prison in Copenhagen. Through every stage, interrogation, trial, appeal, he has maintained that he did not kill Birna. He has never offered the one thing her family and her country most wanted, the truth of why. The detective who ran the investigation, Grimmer Grimson, became something of a national figure through it all, admired for the calm, methodical way he handled both the case and a frightened, grieving public. Remarkably, after 30 years in policing, the murder of Birna Bjarnstadottir was the first homicide case of his career. That single fact says more about Iceland than any statistic could. He went on to represent his country in international law enforcement cooperation, carrying the lessons of the case onto a larger stage. So what does this story finally leave us with beyond sorrow? It leaves us with the fragility of trust and its preciousness. Iceland's safety was never an illusion exactly. It was real, built over generations on genuine community and mutual care. But the case revealed the hard truth that no society, however decent, is immune to the one person who chooses to do harm. The same openness that made Iceland beautiful is what allowed a tired young woman to accept a ride from a stranger without fear. To respond to that by abandoning trust entirely would be its own kind of loss. The challenge Iceland faced, the challenge every community faces after a tragedy like this, was how to grieve, how to grow more careful without surrendering the very thing that made it worth protecting. It leaves us too with a warning about the gap between how a dangerous person appears and what they are. Thomas Mahler Olsen did not look like a monster. He was a working fisherman, unremarkable to the men who shared his ship, reassured by his own captain that the innocent had nothing to fear. There was no visible darkness for anyone to flag in time. That is perhaps the most frightening lesson of all, that evil, when it comes, rarely announces itself. And finally, it leaves us with the unanswered question that hangs over the whole case. The detectives proved how Birna died, and when and where and by whose hand, but they never found why. There was no prior connection, no motive that made human sense, nothing to grasp onto that might make the universe feel a little less cruel. Sometimes there is no reason. Sometimes a life full of music and laughter and unmade plans simply collides with someone else's capacity for harm and is gone. But Birna Bjarnstadottir was never the absence she became in those headlines. She was the friend they called their happy pill. She was the redhead who stayed to dance when everyone else went home, who listened to rap and folk in the same breath, who dreamed of seeing the world beyond her small Arctic island. She was a daughter adored by parents who loved her enough to set their differences aside, a coworker reliable enough that her absence raised the alarm within hours. She was 20 years old and at the very beginning of becoming whoever she was going to be. A whole country said her name as though it were their own and meant it. Her name was Birna Bjarnstadottir. She should have made it home that night the way she had 100 times before. She had so much living left to do, and the world is colder and dimmer for the warmth it lost on a January morning in Reykjavik. We say her name so that the dark she walked into does not get the last word. We say it because she was here and she mattered and she is not forgot. Birna, you deserve to grow old. We are so sorry that you didn't.